Hi, and thanks for joining this new Fireside chat. We have a great guest today, Ian Ashby, who is the Principal Strategist for Customer Service for the EMEA region for ServiceNow. Ian, thanks for taking the time.
Guillaume, it's great to be here. Really looking forward to this.
So Ian, I'm excited about this conversation because you're in a unique position in that you've been on both sides of the equation, right? When it comes to sort of contact centers, you've managed large contact center call centers in your days, your heydays with Epicor. Obviously now you sort of switch sides and you're facilitating the tools that they use with your role at ServiceNow. It goes without saying, it's been a lot has changed this year, and those changes are expected to carry through into 2021. I'm curious, given your background and the conversations you're having with customers today, can you sort of give us your interpretation of what are the trends and what's happening in contact centers and what's going to be the impact of the customer experience?
So thanks, Guillaume. And I think you're right. Hopefully I do bring a bit of a perspective, as you say, of having run large distributed contact centers around the globe, actually. Having worked in the contact center space, in the vendor space, both in my current role in ServiceNow, working with partners like yourselves, but also in prior lives as well. So hopefully I'll bring some interesting perspectives. I guess where I start on this is that I think about the contact center being at the very heart of, if you like, sort of concentric circles. So if you like, contact center in the middle as a large part, but not the only component of customer service. And then customer service being a large part, but not the entirety of the customer experience. And then beyond that, a kind of an overarching framework, which is kind of like customer centricity, which is, the real cultural thing around the way that organizations set themselves up and set their priorities and so on. So to some extent, my view on this is get the contact center right, and it influences positively all those other elements. And conversely, the other way around, get it wrong, and the whole thing starts to implode, if you will. You hit the customer service, you hit the customer experience, you hit the customer centricity that you're looking to drive. So I guess that's one sort of positioning and thinking that I like to have in terms of the role that the contact center plays within the organization. Outbound, inbound, sales, service, whatever, the same thing applying. So I guess that's my first sort of view, and I'm starting to see people think about it in that way. But I do think that there's a lot changing in the contact center, and I think things have accelerated with what we've been going through with COVID and so on. In particular, the move towards digital channels and the move to self-service. And I think that is creating perhaps the most accelerated change that we've seen for a long time in the space around the imperative to get more digital channels, and with that more self-service, to really change the role of the contact center.
So that's interesting. So, and I agree with you. I think you and I were talking offline a little bit earlier, and that part of the issue is that historically, call centers have been a catch-all, right? Any and all issues, just call. But then, of course, you don't know who you're going to get. They don't know what you might be calling about, whether or not they're the right people, whether or not they're enabled in the background. Now, obviously, now you've got the opportunity for self-service. You've got a shifting business model because everyone now is remote. I'm curious, where does I imagine that the difficulty now is if especially with the remote aspect, is how do you, if you're implying and pushing self-service, how as an organization do you still maintain that relationship with customers? And I'm assuming the contact center is going to be a core part of that initiative. Would you agree?
It is, and I think there's some interesting dynamics coming from exactly what you're describing. We've gone to a situation where we've got a lot of work from home currently, and there's a lot of work going on around how is that going to continue? Is it going to be a short-term thing? Will we move back to the office-based contact centers? Will there be more of a blend, etc.? I think the thing that I've not seen many people talk about, I remember back in 2006 talking about home shoring, the idea of actually having people permanently working from home within a contact center environment. And the drivers for that were around, obviously you don't need the real estate, but also that you can have someone from anywhere. You don't have to be in Atlanta you know, to be part of the Atlanta contact center. You can be in Alaska, you can be in California, you can be in Bermuda, you can be wherever. So,
Right.
so you've got that kind of scarce resource that you can leverage. You can have a particular community, perhaps, that you're trying to support in rural areas. It could be someone who maybe is a carer and can only work a few hours a day, you know, and if you put a commute into that, it's not going to work. But if they can work from home, they can do a good job. It's easier to do a night shift. There's no commute involved. It's green credentials. There's lots of things there. But the sort of people that you recruit and the approach that you would take and the things that you're looking for are very different if you go and recruit people to work from home, rather than I've recruited people to work in my center and I've had to send them home because of COVID. You know, and then it's, they haven't got the right working environment. Maybe they don't have the right technology, the right broadband connection. They're sitting on their bed, balancing the laptop on an ironing table, and there's 3 screaming kids in the room next door. So, you know, I think that work from home dynamic that's occurred has occurred, you know, by mistake rather than by planning, and that does cause challenges around how do I know what they're doing? You know, how am I looking after them? Their mental health. You know, the profile, would I have hired that profile as a home worker? You know, actually, no, they need to get in the office because that's where they get their social engagement from, and so on. So I think that's one of the big changes. And I think the challenge or interesting thing for me is, what's that going to look like going forward? Are we going to carry on with the people we would have hired to be in our physical centers, but have them working from home some or all of the time? Or will we actually look for different people and ask different sorts of questions? You know, we'll be asked, rather than saying, what's your commute like? It might be, tell me what your home working environment's like, and have you got somewhere where you can sit quietly and you won't get disturbed, and, you know, your broadband is more than X megabits, and so on and so forth, that would never have been part of the criteria that you were looking at previously.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think it's interesting that you're sort of alluding to the pros and cons, right? But at the same time, I recently read an example of someone where they had a positive spin on the experience, where they called into someone or into an organization. They reached an agent, and you know, there was some dog barking in the background. And funny enough, their interpretation of the situation was, actually, I have a dog, and so they ended up bonding over
Empathy,
the
right?
fact that, yeah,
Yeah.
and their outcome was, look, I resolved my issue, but the entire experience was humanized, if you will. Was made more personal by the fact that I got to know a little bit more about the person that was helping me, and overall that got extrapolated to, I had a pleasant experience with this brand when I needed something, not just to solve my issue, but because I was able to also enjoy the experience that led to the resolution. Obviously, you're not going to have that type of experience over self-service mediums, but again, self-service mediums serve a different purpose. What's your take on that?
It's interesting. I think the empathy thing is really interesting, and you give a really great example there where it could work really positively. I'd maybe take a slightly different spin on that, in the sense that there's a colleague of mine who uses a term, happy hens lay more eggs. And what he means by that is that if you've got you know, happy employees, happy customer service agents, happy contact center agents, they generally will do a better job. They will show more empathy. They will go the extra mile. They will do the things that customers want them to do to do the work. Now, you know, flip that round. If you've got the guy sitting on the edge of the bed, or girl, you know, balancing the laptop on the ironing board, kids running around in the background, shouting, making noise, they're probably not going to be in the best position to do a very empathetic situation.
I would agree.
You know, and conversely, if they've had a 3-hour commute and the train's been delayed or whatever, they might also be in a bad way. You know, there are pros and cons on that, but I think it kind of comes back to, I think, one of the core components, that actually having the right people and having, you know, happy and engaged and empowered customer service representatives makes a huge difference to your customer service provision, your customer experience, if you will. And there's loads of studies by people like KPMG, Nunwood, and so on that show that. And I guess that kind of takes me into my next area that you were kind of asking me. I think there's a really interesting dynamic going on if you take that self-service piece. Most of the time I hear the self-service being talked about, it's the primary initial driver is around cost reduction.
Yep.
That's what most people start with, as you know, we've got this many calls, you know, we want to get rid of a whole bunch of them. We want to get them into a self-service channel through a digital channel, and we reduce cost.
Yep.
But do it right and target the right things. So to target the repetitive, simple, standard things that people really don't want to call about and are quite happy to do through a bot or through a web form or through an IVR or whatever it happens to be that is your preferred self-service channel, if you will. And all of a sudden, first of all, you get a customer satisfaction increment in a positive way, because they're not waiting in line. They can do it 24/7 on their device, you know, on their commute, whatever it happens to be. But then you've taken those volumes out. So all of a sudden, the contact center agents are dealing with the more interesting, more challenging, more value-added things, which is where they can add their real sort of special sauce, if you like, where they can add empathy and really add some things more. So you start to kind of get this virtuous circle. It starts off with cost reduction. It immediately gets you into customer satisfaction, which starts to drive revenue, retention, upsell, that kind of thing. Your agents are happier because they're not dealing with the mundane, they're dealing with the more interesting. Well, happy hens lay more eggs, they do a better customer experience, and by the way, they don't leave, so you don't have the cost. So you've got this sort of virtuous cycle. I call it the multiplier effect. And I think it's a really interesting dynamic that I don't think all contact centers have understood, that actually self-service is a good thing. It's what customers want. The vast majority of customers want that, but actually it can drive not just cost, but revenue and employee sat, and then the things are connected in the ecosystem. So I think it's a very interesting dynamic how that's coming together. I don't know whether you guys are seeing that as well.
We are. That what we're seeing is that the conversations are typically getting longer, but they're more meaningful. But that only works if you've done a good job deflecting the things that really should reach an agent.
Yep.
So you know, interestingly enough, for what we solve for, a lot of individuals think, well, digital channels, self-service, that's a bad thing for call centers and for telephony and so forth. The argument is, no, it's not. I mean, you know, call centers in the past, it was transactional. It's how many people can you help and how quickly, right? The goal was see if you can solve the issue in 30 seconds or less and move on, right? But if all of a sudden, but that was because they were getting so many requests. If you can now disperse or diversify requests, all of a sudden you can afford to spend more time. Again, assuming that the issue needs it because it's complex. So you're not rushing to an answer. You can actually take your time and get to the right answer. And customers appreciate that, right? Because, you know, it's not, can you solve my issue in 30 seconds? Can you solve it so I don't have to call you again?
Correct.
As one example. And so, yeah, we are seeing that. And I think that segues into sort of a broader question. With all your background experience and the conversations you're having, what do you think are going to be the biggest trends? You know, you talk about happy hens lay more eggs, but obviously the business is the one, you know, making the decisions, procuring technologies and so forth. You know, remote work, I think you're right. Everyone thinks it's here to stay, and we've kind of hit on pros and cons. So we'll see how all that shakes out. But of course, you need the technology to basically allow an agent to be as efficient from home as they were before. They don't have 5 screens. They can't swivel chair anymore. Everything needs to be consolidated down to a single agent workspace. What are some of the trends, if you had to pick a few, that you think are going to be the ones that are going to generate the most amount of return for the amount of effort when it comes to shifting? Because that's what's happening, right? Every organizations right now are going to be forced to shift.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on the first one, which is really that digital channel and sort of self-service piece, and how those two things are connected. I think that's a really important component. Yep. You mentioned, I think, another one, which is really around the sort of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and how that can play a component part, and alongside that as well to do some of the grunt work associated with that, and pick up some of the pieces. I think you start to get into that not just from the perspective of the customer and what's going on there, but also on the agent as well, in terms of providing them with you know, next best recommendation. You know, here's the knowledge articles that might be appropriate. Here are the similar cases, that kind of thing. So I think that plays a really important role, both, if you like, externally for the customer in terms of presenting them with ideas and suggestions, but also for the agent. So I think that is starting to come through very strongly, and being a core component. We clearly get some interesting things around the channel side of things as well. You know, the traditional sort of, we've had self-serve for a while. It was called IVR, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's moved now into the digital channels around web, with self-serve there, with service catalog, with intelligent chatbots, with you know, live chat, those sort of things there. Clearly, I think some of the messaging channels as well are starting to come through, both on B2B and B2C, so things like WhatsApp, that kind of area. I think it's going to be interesting to see where that all goes. And I guess in some segments as well, they're expanding into some of the sentiment analysis and using that to try and pick up in some areas. I heard a really interesting one the other day, which I'd not heard of before, which I thought was interesting, was a particular bank that was using voice print sort of technology to look at profiling people based on age when they called in, to think about how to approach that with regards to the current sort of environment, in terms of whether they might be shielding or needing some additional help in the current sort of COVID environment. So it's a really good example of using technology, you know, in a different way, an innovative way that wouldn't have been possible before without things like machine learning and big data and so on, to leverage that kind of in real time in a contact center environment. So some really interesting stuff going on.
So I have one final question. It's not a trick question, but I'm curious what your take on it is, especially as things shift. And I agree with all the trends that you've listed. Historically, we talked about cost a little bit, right? But do you still, and if not, how would you define it now? Are call centers, contact centers still by definition cost centers?
I could kind of guess where you were going with that.
Well, I mean, yeah, maybe. I mean, but it's a thing, right? I mean, they're not. I mean, it's expensive. Let's not deny the fact that it is an investment. And again, when it was a catch-all, it really felt like just a big sunk cost. But if now the call centers, if we make the case, especially with everything going to more of a remote model, maybe there's going to be less face-to-face contact. I can think of restaurants, retail, I mean, et cetera, et cetera. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that I think about the sort of customer satisfaction piece, if you like, and what does it drive? And the logical thing there is, I think of it in three buckets, and it's a revenue bucket. Okay, so that immediately takes you out of just the cost center. If you get the customer satisfaction piece right, and remember what I said, the contact center is a very, very important core component to it. You know, then that gets you your renewal or retention. You know, you get it right, you get your cross-sell, upsell. And if you get it really right, you get your advocacy that helps you new business. So that drives that revenue component, you know, beyond the cost. So I think it's around whether or not you can convince and communicate in that way. I've been working with the UK Contact Center Managers Association quite a lot recently, and they did some work and came up with sort of 5 key themes. And they talk about how, again, they think that COVID has brought contact centers higher up their sort of strategic agenda in terms of their importance, because you kind of the point you were making, if your retail shops are closed, if your offices are closed, if your restaurants are closed or whatever, then the contact center, whether it's through the phone or through chat or responding to email or whatever, they become the face, the only face of the customer, you know, and that it's the way that you're gathering feedback, sentiment, you know, surveys, etc., around what you're doing, what's working, what's not working. So I think in that sense, it's come higher up the agenda. But I still do see some organizations that still put it firmly in the cost center category. I see the more, let's call it progressive ones, who are saying, actually, hang on, it's not as simple as that. You know, there's a revenue component, there's a brand and image component, and those things feed into the customer experience, and that is kind of, you know, that subset to customer centricity and the brand values that we have as an organization. So it's a little bit mixed, but I think the trend is more towards that more nuanced thing that says, no, this is an important component of our overall brand and image that we pass on to our customers.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. Of course, we'll leave it to our audience and see what they think. So to that, if you have any questions that you'd like to put in the comment box to Ian or myself, let's make it conversational. Feel free to add them there. Ian, I know it's you're a busy guy. I really appreciate you taking the time, and we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, I've loved it. Been really good. Always good to talk about a topic that's close to my heart. Thanks for the opportunity.
Anytime, Ian. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care. Thanks.
Bye.